Some places do not stay empty by accident. The rain came down hard over northern Arkansas, turning the dirt roads into ribbons of black mud beneath Ethan Cole's truck tires. Wind rattled the dead corn stalks lining the highway, and somewhere far out beyond the trees, thunder rolled low enough to shake the windows. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears stiff, amber eyes fixed ahead as if he already sensed something waiting in the dark. Ethan drove, without music, without talk, one hand steady on the wheel, while the other rested near the old silver compass hanging beside the dashboard. The farmhouse appeared slowly through the storm, rising from the hills like the skeleton of another forgotten life. 2 stories, white paint peeling in long strips, a sagging porch, one broken weather vane turning against the wind with a slow metallic groan. The place had been abandoned for nearly 8 years, according to the county records. No electricity, no water, no family left to claim it. That was exactly why Ethan bought it. People asked why a former Navy SEAL would waste his money on a dead farm 3 hours from the nearest city. Ethan never answered honestly. The truth was simpler than most people could understand. Silence hurt less than crowds. Since leaving the service, sleep had become something fragile. Every apartment felt too small. Every traffic light sounded too loud. Every stranger's voice reminded him how disconnected he'd become from the world he once protected. Arkansas was supposed to fix none of that. It was only supposed to leave him alone. Ranger suddenly let out a low growl deep in his chest. Ethan slowed the truck near the front gate, headlights sweeping across the soaked property. The old barn leaned sideways under the storm like it had finally grown tired of standing. Tall grass swallowed rusted fence posts. Rainwater dripped through holes in the roof. Everything looked dead, but then Ethan saw it. A faint yellow glow flickering behind the second-floor window of the farmhouse. He narrowed his eyes. The light vanished. Ranger stood immediately, paws against the dashboard now, staring toward the house with a tension Ethan recognized from overseas. Patrols. Not aggression. Alertness. Yeah, Ethan muttered quietly. I saw it too. The truck engine died, leaving only the sound of rain hammering metal and wood. Ethan stepped out into the cold night air, boots sinking half an inch into soaked earth. The storm smelled like wet pine, old smoke, and rotting hay. Ranger jumped down beside him silently, his sable coat darkened by rain within seconds. Ethan grabbed his flashlight from the seat, but didn't turn it on yet. Something about the house stopped him. It did not feel abandoned. Empty houses carried a certain stillness. This place didn't. The porch steps creaked beneath his weight as he climbed them slowly, while the rocking chairs near the door moved gently back and forth in the wind. Then he noticed something that made the hairs rise along his neck. Beside the front door sat a ceramic coffee mug. Rainwater had not collected inside it yet, which meant someone had touched it recently. Ranger stopped beside the window and stared inward without blinking. Ethan followed his gaze. For one brief second, through the thin curtain upstairs, he saw the shape of a human hand disappear into darkness. Ethan did not move for several seconds. Rainwater rolled from the edge of the porch roof and splashed against his boots while the upstairs window faded back into darkness. Ranger remained perfectly still beside him, ears forward, muscles tight beneath his wet coat. The dog was not reacting like he did around danger. This was different, careful, watchful, as if he sensed fear inside the house instead of threat. Ethan slowly reached for the front doorknob. Locked. The old brass rattled softly beneath his hand. He knocked once. No answer. Only the wind moving through broken fence lines and the distant rumble of thunder across the hills. I'm not here to cause trouble, Ethan said calmly, his voice carrying through the storm. I bought this place today. That is all. Silence answered him again. But then came something small, a faint cough from upstairs. Old, weak, human. Ethan stepped back from the door and looked toward the second floor. One curtain shifted slightly before becoming still again. Whoever was inside had no intention of opening that door tonight. Ranger lowered his head and sniffed near the porch floorboards. His tail gave one slow movement before he turned toward the far side of the house. Ethan followed him through the rain. The flashlight beam cut across peeling walls, stacked firewood collapsed by time, and an old tractor half buried in weeds. Near the back entrance, Ranger stopped beside a rusted oil drum. Ethan noticed fresh footprints in the mud. Small, careful, one set deeper than the other, like someone helping another person walk. His chest tightened slightly. Not squatters looking for trouble. Survivors. The back door was cracked open barely an inch. Warm air drifted out, carrying the faint scent of canned soup, kerosene, and damp blankets. Ethan pushed the door gently wider. The kitchen beyond looked frozen in another decade. Floral wallpaper peeled from the walls. Coffee tins sat neatly beside an ancient stove. A lantern flickered low near the sink, casting long shadows across the room. But what caught Ethan's attention most was the table. 2 bowls still warm. 2 spoons. Someone had eaten recently. Ranger entered first, moving slowly across the creaking floorboards without a sound. Ethan followed carefully behind him. Every instinct from his military years told him to scan corners, windows, exits. But this place did not feel dangerous. It felt tired, deeply tired. The living room opened ahead beneath weak golden light. Dust floated through the air like smoke. A faded quilt covered the couch. Beside it sat an oxygen tank nearly empty. Ethan stopped walking. On the far wall hung framed photographs coated in years of dust. Farm animals. A younger couple smiling beside a red barn. A teenage boy in a football jersey. Christmas lights wrapped around a staircase from long ago. An entire life still clinging to the walls. Ranger suddenly looked toward the ceiling and gave a soft whine. Slow footsteps creaked above them. Ethan glanced upward. "Listen," he called gently. "You do not have to hide from me." The footsteps stopped. Another cough followed. Then finally, after a long silence, an old woman's trembling voice drifted down through the darkness above. "Please," she whispered, "do not make us leave tonight." Ethan stood motionless beneath the weak lantern glow while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows behind him. The old woman's voice lingered in the darkness upstairs, trembling with the kind of fear that did not come from one bad night. It came from months, maybe years. Ranger slowly climbed the staircase first, each paw careful against the warped wood. Ethan followed without rushing. Halfway up, he noticed family photographs lining the wall beneath layers of dust. A younger Walter Harper stood beside a tractor with broad shoulders and thick dark hair. One arm around Evelyn, while a boy of maybe 10 grinned between them, holding a fishing pole almost taller than himself. Another frame showed military ribbons pinned beside a folded American flag. The farmhouse had once been alive with ordinary happiness. The second floor smelled faintly of medicine, old blankets, and rain leaking through cracked wood. At the end of the hallway, a bedroom door stood barely open. Ranger stopped there quietly, his tail low, his amber eyes softening in a way Ethan rarely saw. Inside the room sat Evelyn Harper in an old wooden chair wrapped in a faded blue quilt. Thin silver hair rested against her shoulders, and her pale hands trembled around a lantern she held close to her chest. Beside the bed stood Walter Harper, gripping a rusted shotgun with both hands, though the barrel pointed toward the floor instead of Ethan. The old man looked exhausted more than dangerous. His flannel shirt hung loose over his frame, and deep lines cut across his weathered face like dry riverbeds. But his eyes still carried pride. The kind old soldiers never fully lose. Nobody spoke at first. Wind pushed rain against the roof while the lantern flame flickered softly between them. Ranger walked forward without hesitation and sat beside Evelyn's chair. The old woman looked down at him, stunned. Her fingers slowly touched the wet fur along his neck. Ranger closed his eyes for a moment like he understood something Ethan did not. Walter swallowed hard before finally speaking. "We were leaving tomorrow," he said quietly. "We just needed one more night, where it still felt like home." Ethan glanced around the room. A small propane heater hissed near the wall. Empty soup cans sat neatly stacked beside folded blankets. On a nightstand rested several orange prescription bottles, nearly empty. Everything inside the room had been organized with quiet dignity, despite the poverty surrounding it. No stealing, no destruction, just survival. Ethan removed his jacket slowly and draped it across the back of a chair. I am not throwing anybody out tonight, he said. Walter's shoulders loosened slightly, though suspicion still lingered in his eyes. County said this place was abandoned. Ethan continued. Nobody mentioned people living here. Evelyn let out a tired breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Because nobody came looking, she whispered. Silence settled over the room again. Then Walter lowered himself carefully onto the edge of the bed, the old shotgun resting across his knees, untouched now. I built this house in 1974, he said quietly while staring at the floorboards. Every beam, every fence post. Dug the well myself with my son before his senior year. His voice cracked softly at the last word. Ethan noticed the photograph sitting face down beside the lamp. Walter reached over and turned it upright with trembling fingers. The same boy from the staircase, photographs, smiled back from the frame, wearing a baseball cap beneath bright summer sunlight. Ranger rested his head gently against Evelyn's knee while the storm carried on outside. And for the first time since arriving in Arkansas, Ethan no longer felt like he was standing inside an abandoned house. He felt like he had walked into the ruins of someone else's broken prayer. The storm weakened sometime after midnight, leaving only the steady drip of rainwater sliding from the gutters outside the farmhouse. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table while an old kettle warmed slowly on the stove. Ranger lay stretched across the doorway nearby, though his eyes remained open, always watching the staircase. The farmhouse groaned softly around them with every shift of wind, like old bones settling after years of carrying too much weight. Ethan wrapped both hands around a chipped coffee mug Evelyn had insisted he use. The coffee tasted thin and bitter, but warm. Warmer than most nights he had spent over the past 3 years. Upstairs, he could hear faint coughing again, followed by Walter's quiet footsteps crossing the hallway. The old man moved slowly, carefully, as though every stair and floorboard belonged to memory itself. Ethan stared at the faded kitchen curtains moving gently near the cracked window. He had planned to spend this first night unpacking tools and sleeping on the floor beside Ranger. Instead, he found himself inside another family sorrow. That feeling unsettled him more than danger ever had. Evelyn eventually descended the stairs wrapped in her blue quilt, carrying a small tin box pressed against her chest. Her silver hair looked softer now beneath the lantern light, though exhaustion still shadowed her pale face. She stopped when she noticed Ethan awake. I did not mean to keep you from resting, she said quietly. Ethan shook his head once. Never been very good at sleeping. A faint smile crossed her lips at that. She lowered herself carefully into the chair across from him, while Ranger immediately stood and rested his head beside her knee again. Evelyn stroked the thick fur behind his ears absent-mindedly. He reminds me of her boy's dog, she whispered. Ethan looked up. You had a German shepherd? His name was Duke, she said softly. Followed Caleb everywhere from the age of 12. The name lingered in the room for a moment. Caleb, the boy from the photographs. Ethan noticed Evelyn staring toward the old refrigerator where faded magnets still held school drawings against the rusted metal door. Walter still talks like Caleb might walk through that front door someday, she admitted quietly. I suppose part of me still listens for it too. Ethan remained silent. People carried grief differently. Some buried it. Some polished it daily until it became part of who they were. The kettle hissed softly on the stove. Evelyn opened the small tin box slowly. Inside sat folded letters tied with twine, a tarnished silver watch, and several unpaid medical bills yellowed by time. Ethan's eyes paused on the envelopes, stamped final notice in red ink. Evelyn noticed. Caleb got sick after the factory closed. She explained gently. No insurance. No savings left by then. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the letters. Walter sold tractors first, then the cattle, then pieces of the land. Ethan listened without interruption while rainwater tapped softly against the windows behind them. By the time Caleb passed, she continued, the bank already owned almost everything except this house. 6 months later, they took that too. Her voice cracked softly on the final words. Ranger pushed closer against her chair as though sensing the pain beneath them. Ethan glanced around the kitchen again. The peeling wallpaper, the patched cabinets, the ancient clock above the doorway frozen at 2:17. Every inch of the house still carried traces of people who had fought desperately to keep loving each other while life slowly stripped everything else away. "Why come back here?" Ethan finally asked. Evelyn looked toward the staircase where Walter's footsteps had stopped. "Because this is the last place Caleb was happy," she whispered. "And when the world forgets you, sometimes you return to the last place that remembered your name." Morning arrived slowly over the Arkansas hills, wrapped in silver fog and the smell of wet earth drifting through broken window screens. Ethan woke in the old recliner near the kitchen stove with Ranger stretched across the floor beside him. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the farmhouse settled around him with a low wooden creak, and memory returned with the pale dawn light. Somewhere upstairs, old pipes groaned softly. The storm had passed. Ranger lifted his head first, ears twitching toward the back door. Ethan stood carefully, stiff from sleep, and stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. The farm looked different in daylight. Sadder somehow. Rusted fencing disappeared into waist-high grass. The barn roof sagged heavily on one side. Wind spun loose sheets of tin with hollow metallic knocks that echoed across empty fields. Yet beneath all the decay, Ethan could still see traces of care. Flower beds buried, beneath weeds, hand-carved fence posts, wind chimes hanging crooked beside the porch. Someone had loved this place deeply once. Ranger trotted ahead through the wet grass toward the old barn. Ethan followed quietly. The morning air smelled of pine, mud, and soaked hay. Inside the barn, shafts of pale sunlight slipped through cracks in the walls, illuminating floating dust like drifting smoke. Ethan noticed old tools still hanging neatly above a workbench. Gardening gloves folded carefully beside rusted nails. Even abandoned, the farm still carried discipline. Ranger stopped near the far corner beside a stack of covered crates. His nose pressed gently against one before he looked back toward Ethan. Ethan pulled away the tarp slowly. Underneath sat dozens of framed photographs wrapped in blankets to protect them from moisture. Family birthdays, Christmas mornings, a teenage Caleb holding ribbons beside livestock at county fairs, Walter teaching him how to hammer fence boards beneath a bright summer sky. Ethan stared silently at the images. Entire decades preserved inside cardboard boxes because two elderly people could not bear losing the last proof their life had mattered. Walter could never throw those away. Ethan turned at the sound of Evelyn's voice behind him. She stood near the barn entrance, holding her quilt tightly around her shoulders, while morning wind lifted strands of silver hair across her face. Ranger immediately walked to her side. "He said memories rot slower in barns," she added quietly with a tired smile. Ethan glanced toward the photographs again. "You kept all this hidden out here?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "The bank cleared most of the house years ago. Furniture, appliances, anything they thought had value." Her eyes drifted toward the boxes. They did not care about photographs. Ethan swallowed hard. Something about those words stayed with him. They did not care about photographs, as if memory itself had become worthless to the world outside these fields. Evelyn stepped deeper into the barn while Ranger stayed pressed gently against her leg. "Walter used to wake before sunrise every day," she said softly. "Fed cattle before breakfast. Fixed neighbors' tractors for free. Coached Little League in town." She smiled faintly at the memory. People used to stop by this farm constantly. Ethan looked around the silent barn. "What happened?" Evelyn's eyes lowered toward the dirt floor. "People get uncomfortable around grief," she whispered. "After Caleb passed, visitors became holidays. Then phone calls. Then nothing." Wind moved through the barn walls with a low, mournful whistle. Ethan watched Ranger rest his head against Evelyn's hand while she absent-mindedly stroked the thick fur along his neck. The old dog collar hanging near the workbench suddenly caught Ethan's attention. Faded leather. Brass tag, nearly worn smooth. "Duke." Evelyn noticed him looking. "Caleb's dog," she said softly. "He stayed by the hospital door for 3 days after Caleb died. Refused food. Refused water." Her voice trembled slightly. "Sometimes I think animals understand loss better than people do." Ethan glanced at Ranger. The German shepherd stood quietly beside Evelyn, as if guarding something fragile inside her that the world had already damaged enough. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the numbness he carried from place to place. Not peace, not happiness, something smaller, the dangerous beginning of caring again. By the third morning, the farmhouse no longer sounded completely empty. Small noises had begun returning to it. Cabinet doors opening, water running briefly through repaired pipes, the scrape of a broom across old wooden floors. Ethan stood beneath the kitchen sink, tightening a rusted valve while cold water dripped steadily onto his sleeve. Ranger slept nearby in a patch of morning sunlight pouring through the window, though one ear remained alert to every movement upstairs. Outside, fog rolled slowly across the fields, softening the broken fences and dead grass beneath pale Arkansas light. Ethan tightened the wrench one final time. The pipes rattled violently for a second before clear water sputtered from the faucet. Evelyn gasped softly behind him. "Walter!" she called toward the hallway, her voice carrying something Ethan had not heard from her before. Hope. Heavy. Footsteps descended carefully down the staircase. Walter appeared wearing an old denim jacket over his flannel shirt, his tired eyes narrowing in confusion as Ethan stepped aside from the sink. Water flowed steadily into the basin now. Clean. Constant. Walter stared at it in silence. Then he slowly reached forward and placed his weathered hands beneath the stream like a man afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. "I forgot what that sounded like," he whispered. Ethan looked away quietly, pretending to focus on his toolbox while emotion thickened the old man's voice behind him. Ranger rose from the floor and walked to Walter's side, pressing against his leg gently. Walter rested one trembling hand on the dog's neck without taking his eyes off the running water. The farmhouse breathed differently after that. Small changes spread room by room over the next few days. Ethan patched broken sections of the porch roof before another storm rolled through. He repaired loose steps, cleared brush on the front path, and rebuilt the old stove vent with spare metal from the barn. None of the work was perfect, but perfection had never been the point. The place only needed warmth again. One afternoon, Ethan returned from town, carrying groceries and a fresh oxygen tank strapped carefully into the truck bed. Evelyn stood frozen near the porch when she saw it. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged while unloading canned soup and medicine onto the kitchen counter. "I was going into town anyway." But the truth sat heavier inside him than he cared to admit. He had not planned on staying this long. He had not planned on caring whether strangers ate dinner or slept warm through the night. Yet every morning Ranger chose to remain near Walter and Evelyn instead of following Ethan around the property. The German shepherd slept outside their bedroom door, sat beside Walter during coughing fits, rested his head against Evelyn's lap while she sorted old photographs at the kitchen table. Ranger had once trusted almost nobody after Ethan rescued him from a neglect case years earlier, watching the dog attach himself so completely to the elderly couple unsettled Ethan in ways he could not explain. Late one evening, Ethan found Walter alone on the porch sharpening an old pocket knife beneath the glow of a lantern. Crickets hummed through the dark fields while warm wind carried the smell of fresh rain and pine. Walter glanced toward Ranger, sleeping beside the porch swing. "That dog sees things before people do," he said quietly. Ethan leaned against the railing without answering. Walter continued sharpening slowly. "You know why Duke stayed by the hospital door after Caleb passed?" Ethan shook his head once. Walter's eyes drifted toward the fields, disappearing into darkness. "Because animals do not understand abandoning the ones they love." Silence settled between them for a long moment. Then Walter looked toward Ethan with tired but steady eyes. "Truth is," he admitted softly, "I think Ranger knew before we did that you were not sent here to buy a farm. The letter arrived on a gray Thursday morning tucked between grocery ads and utility flyers inside the rusted mailbox by the road. Ethan almost missed it. Ranger noticed it first, standing stiff beside the gate while cold wind moved through the fields in long, restless waves. The envelope carried the county seal across the front in sharp black print. Ethan opened it while walking back toward the farmhouse, boots crunching softly over damp gravel. By the time he reached the porch, his jaw had tightened. Walter noticed immediately. The old man sat near the window, repairing a cracked lantern with slow, careful movements. But his eyes lifted the moment Ethan entered the kitchen. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. Ethan placed the envelope on the table without answering right away. Evelyn lowered her spoon slowly beside her bowl of soup. Ranger remained standing near Ethan's side, alert to the tension spreading through the room. Finally, Ethan exhaled. "County reassessed the property this week," he said. "There is a development company interested in buying farmland through this area." Walter stared at the envelope like he already knew the rest before Ethan spoke another word. "They want inspections completed by Monday," Ethan continued carefully. "If unauthorized, residents are found living on the property, they can involve the sheriff's office." Silence settled across the kitchen heavier than thunder. Outside, clouds rolled low above the dead winter fields while loose tin rattled softly against the barn roof. Evelyn looked down at her hands. Walter simply nodded, once as though disappointment had become too familiar to surprise him anymore. "I told you this would happen," he murmured quietly. "Places like this do not stay invisible forever." Ethan watched the old man stand slowly from the table and walk toward the staircase without another word. Ranger immediately followed him upstairs. A few minutes later, Ethan heard drawers opening and closing above the kitchen ceiling. Wooden boxes sliding across floors. The sound carried something worse than panic. Surrender. Evelyn remained seated at the table, staring at the untouched soup growing cold in front of her. "He is packing Caleb's things," she whispered. Her eyes shimmered beneath the weak kitchen light. "Walter only does that when he thinks goodbye is permanent." Ethan rubbed one hand across his face slowly. He had dealt with armed missions overseas. Hostage rescues. Disasters. Yet somehow this quiet farmhouse and two exhausted elderly people unsettled him more deeply than any battlefield ever had. Because there was no enemy here to fight. Only time, debt, loneliness. The kinds of things no training prepares a man to defeat. Upstairs, Ranger began whining softly. Ethan climbed the staircase and found Walter sitting on the bedroom floor beside open cardboard boxes. Framed photographs rested carefully inside folded blankets, while old military medals lay lined across the bedspread beside yellowed paperwork. Walter held a tiny pair of worn cowboy boots in his hands. Child-sized. Ethan stopped in the doorway without speaking. Walter stared down at the boots for a long moment before finally saying, "Caleb wore these every day one summer. Refused to take them off even in church." A faint smile touched his tired face before fading again. Funny the things people save when they know everything else is slipping away. Ranger rested beside Walter silently, his head pressed against the old man's knee. Ethan looked around the room. The peeling wallpaper, the leaking ceiling stain above the bed, the tiny pieces of a family packed away like belongings no one else wanted. "You do not need to leave yet," Ethan said quietly. Walter shook his head slowly. "Son, men like me learn eventually that the world does not stop moving just because your heart broke inside one place." He placed the little boots carefully into the box and closed the lid with trembling hands. "But I appreciate you trying." Ethan stood there longer than he realized while dusk slowly darkened the windows around them. Then Ranger lifted his head and looked directly at Ethan with those steady amber eyes. Not pleading, not afraid, just waiting. As though the dog already knew there was still one decision left for Ethan Cole to make. The first snow of the season arrived early that Sunday evening, drifting quietly across the Arkansas fields like ash from a distant fire. Ethan stood alone near the barn with both hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, while Ranger circled slowly through the pale grass beside him. The farmhouse windows glowed softly behind them now, warm against the growing dark. But inside the house, Walter continued packing boxes one careful memory at a time. Ethan could feel it happening room by room. The old couple was preparing themselves to disappear again before the world forced them to. That thought settled heavily in his chest. A pair of headlights suddenly swept across the front gate. Ranger stiffened instantly. A Black County SUV rolled slowly up the driveway, tires crunching over frozen gravel before stopping beside the porch. Ethan recognized the look immediately. Pressed shirts, clipboard, business before compassion. A tall man stepped out wearing a dark wool coat against the cold. Mid-50s, clean boots untouched by mud. "Ethan Cole," the man called while shutting the door behind him. Ethan nodded once. "Daniel Mercer," the man replied, extending a hand Ethan did not take. "I represent Ridgeline Agricultural Development." Ranger moved closer to Ethan's side, ears forward. Mercer glanced briefly at the German Shepherd before continuing. "Beautiful property you purchased here. A lot of opportunity in this county now." Snowflakes melted against his shoulders while he smiled the kind of smile Ethan never trusted. "I am here to discuss acquisition options before the county inspection tomorrow morning." Ethan remained silent. Mercer opened his folder calmly. Ridgeline plans to consolidate several farms through this area. Poultry facilities, storage sites, logistics expansion. His eyes drifted toward the farmhouse windows glowing behind Ethan. "Of course, we understand there may be complications involving unauthorized occupants." The word occupants landed colder than the snow itself. Not people, not elderly homeowners. Occupants. Ranger let out a low growl. Mercer took half a step back before recovering his composure. "Look," he said more carefully, "we are prepared to offer generous compensation for a smooth transition. But once county enforcement gets involved tomorrow, things become unpleasant for everybody." Ethan stared at the falling snow for several seconds before finally speaking. "You ever serve?" Mercer blinked slightly. "Excuse me?" "Military," Ethan clarified quietly. "You ever serve anybody beside yourself?" The wind carried silence between them. Mercer cleared his throat stiffly. "I'm simply doing my job." Ethan looked toward the farmhouse. Through the kitchen window, he could see Evelyn standing near the sink beside Walter, both of them small beneath the yellow light, while Ranger's shadow stretched across the porch behind him. A forgotten family trying not to lose the last piece of their life. Again, something inside Ethan shifted then. Not sudden, not dramatic, just a quiet certainty settling into place. The kind soldiers feel right before making decisions they already know they cannot walk away from. "This farm is not for sale," Ethan said calmly. Mercer frowned. "Mr. Cole, you bought this property less than 2 weeks ago, and I am keeping it." Mercer's expression hardened. "County inspection still happens tomorrow." Ethan nodded once. "Then they can inspect it." Snow continued drifting between them, while Ranger stood perfectly still beside Ethan, amber eyes locked forward beneath the porch light. Mercer slowly closed his folder. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be." Ethan finally met the man's eyes fully. "No," he said quietly. "I think people already did that years ago." Mercer left without another word. The SUV disappeared down the frozen driveway beneath swirling snow and darkness. Ethan remained standing there long after the taillights vanished. Behind him, the farmhouse door creaked open softly. Walter stepped onto the porch wrapped in his old denim jacket, while Evelyn stood just inside the doorway, clutching her quilt tightly around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke. They had heard enough. Ethan climbed the porch steps slowly, while Ranger brushed past him into the warmth of the house. Walter's tired eyes shimmered beneath the porch light. "Son," he whispered carefully, "you do not owe us this fight." Ethan looked past the old man into the farmhouse glowing softly against the winter night. For the first time in years, the place no longer felt like somewhere he came to hide from life. It felt like somewhere worth standing his ground for. The county truck arrived just after sunrise beneath a pale winter sky streaked with silver clouds. Frost still clung to the fence posts, and smoke drifted lazily from the farmhouse chimney into the cold Arkansas air. Ethan stood on the porch beside Walter and Evelyn while Ranger sat quietly at the top step, alert but calm. The farm no longer looked abandoned. Not completely. Fresh boards reinforced the porch railing now. The front path had been cleared. Warm light glowed behind clean kitchen windows. Small signs of care had returned to the place like life, slowly finding its way back into tired bones. 2 county officials stepped from the truck carrying clipboards and inspection folders. One was younger, maybe 30, with nervous eyes and stiff movements against the cold. The other was older, heavy-set, his weathered face softened by years spent around rural towns and difficult stories. He removed his gloves slowly as he approached the porch. "Morning," he said politely. Ethan nodded once. "Morning." The older official glanced briefly toward Walter and Evelyn before looking back at Ethan. "We received concerns regarding unlawful occupancy and unsafe living conditions." His voice carried professionalism, but not cruelty. Ethan stepped aside from the doorway. "Then come see the place for yourselves." The inspection lasted nearly an hour. The officials checked wiring Ethan had repaired, water access, heating, roof stability, and structural damage throughout the farmhouse. Ranger followed quietly behind them the entire time, never barking once. Walter remained mostly silent during the walkthrough, while Evelyn nervously twisted the edge of her quilt in her hands near the kitchen table. Ethan noticed how carefully the old couple avoided looking directly at the officials, as though years of loss had trained them to expect rejection before kindness. Finally, the older inspector closed his folder beside the front door. The room fell still. Even the old clock above the stove seemed quieter. "Technically," the man began slowly, "the property still requires additional repairs before it fully meets county residential standards." Walter lowered his eyes immediately. Evelyn gripped her quilt tighter. Then the inspector looked around the farmhouse once more, at the patched roof beams, the repaired sink, the family photographs returned carefully to the walls. Ranger resting beside Walter's boots. Something in the man's expression softened. "But I have seen far worse homes holding far less love than this one." Silence settled over the room. The younger official looked surprised. The older man cleared his throat gently before continuing. "We will file this property under active restoration status." Walter blinked slowly. "Meaning?" Ethan asked carefully. The inspector tucked the folder beneath his arm. "Meaning nobody is being removed from this farmhouse today." Evelyn covered her mouth with trembling fingers as tears welled suddenly in her tired eyes. Walter sat down heavily at the kitchen table like his legs could no longer carry the weight of relief pressing through him. Ranger stood immediately and rested his head across the old man's knee. The inspector gave Ethan a long, quiet look before heading toward the door. "You did good here," he said softly. "Not many people would have." After they left, the farmhouse remained silent for several moments, except for the crackling stove fire and the distant cry of crows drifting across the winter fields. Then Walter slowly reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out an old brass key attached to a faded leather tag. He stared at it for a moment before placing it gently into Ethan's hand. "This was Caleb's," he whispered. "He always said one day this farm would help people who needed a second chance." Ethan looked down at the worn key resting in his palm, while emotion tightened quietly in his chest. Outside, snow began melting beneath weak afternoon sunlight. Water dripped steadily from the barn roof while wind carried the scent of pine and thawing earth across the hills. Weeks later, neighbors would begin stopping by the farmhouse again. Some brought lumber. Some brought food. One retired veteran brought 3 abandoned German shepherd puppies needing shelter. By spring, the old farm had become something nobody planned, yet somehow everyone needed. A place where forgotten dogs slept beside tired veterans. A place where lonely people stayed long enough to feel seen again. And some evenings, as golden light stretched across the repaired porch and Ranger slept beneath Walter's rocking chair, Ethan would sit quietly watching the fields sway beneath the Arkansas sky and realized that peace had not arrived in his life like thunder or triumph. It arrived softly, like an old farmhouse remembering how to keep its lights on for people coming home.